Amen. Thank you for reading that, Morgan. She works her way over here. We're going to have a discussion surrounding those words, things that pop out that are interesting to us that hopefully we can translate into interest for you to follow up more on the Gospel of John. Just some cool stuff. Different stuff sometimes. And when we were talking about, some things that stood out to us before, that was the first one that came to my mind is they had been sent from the Pharisees. Whether it's the Pharisees, doesn't matter, but they ask him, are you the Messiah or Elijah or the prophet? And he says no to all of those. And that's not what all the Gospels say, at least in how John is portrayed. And I didn't really have an answer for that. I think probably John was just trying to do something different theologically, but I feel like you had a take on it, if I was not mistaken.
Well, I think the interesting thing about John is he focuses on the cosmic Christ, meaning like last gathering we read John 1:1, which is a very different origin story for Christ than the other Gospels. It gives us that Christ was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it basically always, John is continually reshifting how folks think about Christ, and really most of the key players. And so I think that captures, once again, in this particular example of John the Baptist, in that he doesn't care whether he's the true rebirth of Elijah, the symbolism of Elijah, the prophet. He knows his specific call and his specific focus in a way that at least the author of the Gospel of John really wants to highlight. And I think that's what we see here. Whereas the other Gospels are trying to get at something maybe a bit more pragmatic. They're much more pragmatic Gospels than the Gospel of John is. And so I think we see just the authorship of the Gospel of John coming through even in how John the Baptist identifies himself.
Yeah, and when I did a little bit more follow-up with that, Jesus, I believe in Matthew, says, if you will accept it, John is Elijah. That doesn't necessarily mean that John was or wasn't, just, as John is implying in this passage, I know who I am. If you want to see me in some other light, that's kind of on you. So he is the one crying out in the wilderness and preparing the way of the Lord. And that harkens back again to Isaiah. There's lots of Isaiah language and light and darkness. And as you said, it comes after the beginning, the prologue, where the Word was with and was, and it's powerful language that requires some interpretation as well. So I think that's still going.
Some is very generous there, Matt. Yeah, some interpretation. I know when I was reading it the first time, not for today, but in general, one of the things that always stands out to me is that John says he doesn't know Jesus. They're cousins, and John has always been the forerunner. He leapt, as we're told, in his mother Elizabeth's womb at the very knocking or approach of Mary.
Yeah, I mean, even if he's in the womb and doesn't remember that, surely he was told the story.
That is fair. Yes, that is definitely part of his origin story, right? But even if they weren't visiting frequently, they likely knew of one another because Elizabeth and Zachariah's own experience of getting John, they had prophecies about who John would be, just as Mary and Joseph had about who Jesus would be. Those stories aren't things parents are going to be like, oh, you're your own. I'm not going to tell you how you got here. They're going to be things that are shared and celebrated. And, even if they were like, we're not going to tell him because we don't want to influence him. We want him to have his own way. I don't think that was really the approach to parenting in biblical times. I could be wrong. But especially for good practicing Jews who knew the promise of a Messiah and what it meant for their people. I can only imagine what it would be to be like, you're the one who's going to lay the foreground for this Messiah. Who is your cousin? So the fact that John the Baptist is like, I don't know him, but sounds like a great guy, is fascinating to me. That again, familial relations, I don't think matter to the gospel writer of John.
Yeah, and it makes me beg the question, in all of the Gospels, just in our Bible, we don't have much context to young Jesus. We got the 12-year-old Jesus story and the birth story, and then we got 30-year-old Jesus starting his ministry, or at least his public ministry. And I wonder if maybe this is a little hint as to why. This isn't, necessarily my full belief, but just reflecting on it, if John is saying, I don't know him, maybe he knows Jesus, the person, but maybe he doesn't know the fullness of what Jesus is embarking on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Also in the sense of, did Jesus fully know who he was until these moments where others were naming it as well, right? Because from the very beginning, Jesus needed others to be fully who he was. And so in that case, that actually fits really beautifully with the writings of John, where it's saying, yeah, I know the man, my cousin Jesus, but this Messiah I have not seen yet. And that also gives a really beautiful context for where John the Baptist's own identity is, in the sense of his purpose. He knows he is to lay the foreground, the voice in the wilderness crying out, make way for the Lord. And yet he's saying, I am doing my work, but he has not come yet. And I think that's also something really significant, that sometimes even in our own journeys, we want to know the destination. But more often than not, we only have at best a step or two next. And it can feel hard to be faithful to live into that call. But John the Baptist does a really beautiful job of doing what he is called to do, even though he doesn't, as he notes, at least in this gospel, know who the Messiah is.
And what he says that he came to do, besides making straight the way of the Lord, is to baptize with water. And when I was thinking about it, I didn't have much context for Jewish baptism. And you had hinted at there was some sort of ritual purity involved in that. If you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, so in some traditions, and I don't know how common it is today, the Jewish baptismal waters were deep enough that you would fully submerge yourself through walking. So it wasn't a dunking the way we do. It's almost like think of an actual swimming pool, but it just has like a V or a U at the end, and you walk down in and you walk out. Usually you have your given name, and then you come out with your Hebrew name.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
And again, I don't know how commonly practiced, but I know that when you Google Jewish baptism, ancient times, you can see some of these pools. And so I think there's, connection to where we see, because oftentimes it's like, well, why is John baptizing in the river then? What is that? And John was out in the wilderness. So this may have been really a de-tempolizing aspect
moving
of
away from
I will baptize the crowds and the multitudes. And so that may be really where we see a shift in that practice, but it wasn't that John created the practice himself.
Right. Just living into it in this new way, kind of ushering in what's next. As you said, the word pool made me think of the pool of Siloam. Is that right?
Yeah, there is a pool of
to
Siloam.
tell the blind man to go wash. Do you have any idea? And no is totally fine, because I don't. If that was one of those.
I think that was one of the healing pools.
Okay.
At least in context. I don't think it was
So it wouldn't
used
necessarily be a stairway up down.
No. Well, there were stairs down into it, but the pool of Siloam was believed that when you go in, if God passes by, the waters become healing. And so you can be healed. But the baptism practice, from what I understand, was part of purity. And so you wouldn't have had somebody who was unwell in the waters that were intended for purity. But it also gets into interesting questions around just the use of water. And when we think about the origin story that John talks about, where the Word was with God, and then if we go back to Genesis, the waters of chaos, that there's this clear marking of how water often is present when there is healing or newness or a rebirth of some kind. And if John is preparing the way of the Lord, and even though this particular gospel doesn't say he actually baptizes Jesus, the last bit of the text that we read today kind of captures that. I saw, a dove descend and wait, or stay. And that sounds like, from the other gospels anyway, what he's alluding to is the baptism of Jesus. And
which is interesting that Jesus isn't baptized in this passage.
Text.
Yeah.
Right. And so, again, I think John is helping us get to the bigger picture, the universal picture of how Christ is to understand his public ministry, and how John, even as the forerunner, is to be understood. And I think, sometimes we think of forerunner and we're like, oh, that's nice. But more often than not, like, I think about the relay race. The first person is usually not like the fastest, but they're the one to set the pace. You can't have somebody who doesn't know their time, speed, ability. And then you have to have the person who knows how to close it out. And so the distinction around role and purpose, and that there isn't a jealousy or a bidding or any of those types of things.
Well, that's just it with the relay analogy. Like, you have to be able to hand it off. You don't get to run the whole race. You get to hand it off to the closer. Yeah.
Well, and I wonder, because you had notes around, what does this mean for us today, and how do we actually understand John the Baptizer's role in our own living things out, right? Sometimes we can keep things really nice here in the chapel and it sounds really good, but what do we do with it when we leave here? And what does it mean that John needed his specific role and Jesus needed to receive that as well? Jesus could have been what if Jesus had replied to John in this particular gospel text anyway, the way he responded to his mother Mary? Now is not the time. Right. And John's like, cool, but I'm pretty sure it is. I'm here baptizing, and my
here's
head's
the baton,
about
please take it.
Yeah. And so I'm curious for you, when you think about what this means for us today, especially in light of Christmastide and just this tough season, there's a lot happening. Where do we get any of those kind of life lesson type pieces when you think of this particular text?
Yeah, finding our own call and purpose, I feel like, is so important. And in both of these cases, they had prophecies around their lives. I don't know many people that have individual prophecies.
That's fair.
To live into. So we kind of get to choose our own path in a sense as we live into how the Spirit leads us. In today's world and society, whether that's in church or in schools or in families, I see this translating well to continue the relay sort of idea in mentorship and in generational passing of the torch. Yeah. This isn't to call out everyone in, every previous generation, but I feel like there is a little bit of a hesitancy to hand over the reins of power in politics, in theological discussions, to the younger generations, whether that's a doubt in leadership capacity or character traits that are seen in the new generations, or if it's just a kind of a holding on to that baton. And I can see that, John continues to do his thing after Jesus comes and steps into his own ministry. We hear about John later on, and it continues to do wonderful things. But here we see, I'm going to keep doing my thing, but this is the guy. You need to really pay attention to this guy. I see that being relevant.
Well, and that humble spirit of knowing what is yours to do versus feeling like you have to do it all or feeling like you can't do anything. And so when you were talking about family dynamics or generational dynamics, being able, as you were saying, whether it's lack of trust or a question of character or any of those pieces, ultimately the invitation is to be well with yourself. And from that being well internally, external relationships you have can begin to be made well also. And how to be at peace with that. I struggle to often know what's mine to do and what's somebody else's work to do versus just doing it. and being like, well, you seem really stressed, so I'll just do it, versus saying, how can I help you? And I think that John has a really meaningful example, both from the generational dynamic you were talking about to day-to-day interactions, where it's, here's what I'm here to do, but you're not alone. I can be present with you, I can journey alongside you or before you, and still let you do what is yours. And in a hurting, complex, messy world, being able to really say, I want you to be able to do what is yours. Not because you're passing the buck, but to say, you have unique skills. You have the ability to do this in a way only you can. And I want the world to see that. How can I help you with that? And that humble nature that John presents, and even Christ presents in their timing. We don't hear Christ say, well, John, you could have done it better. But to say, like, you did it, I'm doing it. How do we move forward? And when you were talking, it almost reminded me of like hype people, right? Like the hype man, like, you did a great job. Yes, let's do this.
Get ready for.
Exactly. We need more hype people in the world. We need to be encouraging. We need to be supportive. We need to be truthful. John is as truthful in his own identity, not taking on titles that don't fit him, at least in this gospel, and even in others where Jesus is like, if you will, here you go, but there's no forcing. And so to be able to really have this gentle approach of just like, you will do great, I will do great, and in that greatness, we will bring even more goodness to the world. And I really like how you talked about that from a generational standpoint, and just this, that requires trust and willingness to be vulnerable in spaces. So,
yes. And I see in that last line that I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God. And while we all have our own callings and walks of life and influence, things that we can contribute and offer in our own ways, I think even just our own story is so important to be able to share, that we can testify that we have seen and experienced this Jesus character in our own lives, and not to hold it for ourselves, but to pass on that story. Hollywood keeps, reinventing the same story over and over and over again, and it may be similar or completely unique. That's not the point. It's your story, and it's yours to tell and to share, and your story may resonate with someone in a way that maybe their parents didn't or their friends didn't, and if they don't get to hear that story, they may not get to know the fullness of who the Son of God is. Yeah.
I think that's a good transition point. And to just say, as I think we were talking earlier in our discussion around this and what this could be like, is to say Christ wasn't known without John in the way that we now know him. Christ wasn't who we know Christ to be without Mary or without the disciples, and even without the early generations who boldly dealt with persecution so that the story could continue. And for those of us today to be able to say, you are the living testament, both in word and deed, and how can you go forth from this place to actually allow, as Matt was just noting, the world to know Christ. Christ can't be known without you and without all of us. And in this Christmastide season, I hope we can find beauty and meaning in that so that we too carry on being the ones who offer testament to who Christ is and who we are. Amen.